right, everybody, welcome to Mitigating Risk Through Contract Development. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Thank you. Looks like we got some folks rolling in, so that's good. Just to let everyone know, this meeting is being recorded. I've had a few questions so far from people who couldn't make it. We will record it and post it and share it for you to review the material or share with other people. That being said, thanks for coming to the live version. We're going to start off with a little poll here to get you thinking about your experience working with state contracts. How experienced are you at working with state contracts? None at all. Maybe we have some newbies out there. Some, meaning a little bit. A lot, meaning that's a huge part of your job, or a ton, which is like how people in the State Procurement Bureau probably would describe the amount of work they do with state contracts. Hi, Carrie. Good morning. I do want to say we have a new employee, Roman Hall, and he's here this morning. So welcome him to the State Procurement Bureau. Okay, it looks like we have a bit of a mix of some and a lot, not too much, a ton. So it looks like the generalization some is the way a lot of you would describe your experience working with state contracts. So I'm going to tell you for a minute who we are. My name is Natalie Petersey. I'm a trainer at the Procurement Bureau. My boss is Megan Homeland. She's the bureau chief. She's on the line here. John Thomas is our senior administrative officer. He's going to help us out a little bit. And then the procurement support supervisor, Tia Snyder's here as well. I want to say right away, we're going to discuss this topic at a very high level, and we're not going to address any specific type of contract. So it's important to remember that we are not lawyers, although some of us may talk like lawyers, and we're talking about this in a really generalized and high level way. And every contract is different, and every contract needs to be approached in a specific and careful way, but we're going to talk about all of this in general. So the reason we put together this webinar this morning was because from some survey data, this idea of risk management was something that several people brought up that they'd like more information about. So what you need to remember by the end of this presentation, and in general, is that one of the ways that you can address risk in state contracts is to address it on the front end by paying close attention to your contract and looking at it from the other end of after it is awarded and it's in process. What did you do in the contract development phase to ensure you would get what you needed or wanted? So before you even get to the contract phase, consider what risks you can mitigate in the solicitation process. So right from the very beginning. And again, always work closely with your legal counsel from start to finish on a contract. So the solicitation phase is really an important part of setting yourself up for success with a contract. So one of the things you need to do in that initial phase and working through the entire phase of contract management is to manage your liability, the required insurance, performance bonds and other types of security. And we're going to cover that here in a minute. Always be prepared and try to anticipate contract changes. Try to anticipate any kind of disputes that that could arise. Think about the performance you want to see and how the use of subcontractors might affect this. Always keep a copy of the winning proposal and bid with the contract file. That way you can always reference it, and maintain copies of everything. I think one of the things I've heard repeatedly while developing this training was document, document, document. Maintain copies of the contract, any amendments, milestones, insurance, and required notifications. You want to define and communicate who has authority to make changes or decisions affecting the contract for both the state and the contractor. Maintain contract performance records, who, what, when, what issue, what result, what was the plan going forward, and any specifics involved in the discussions. Always reference relevant contract clauses and any decisions made and agreed to by the parties. Everything that you do is intended to protect the state interests. So that's one great way to think about it. Another thing, everybody here at all my contract officers that are listening know, is that by submitting a response to an RFP, the offeror does accept the state's terms and conditions. The venue cannot be changed in statute. This is something we talk about a lot. And everything is designed to protect state interests. So right away, the offer is getting this acceptance of contract. Officers requesting additions or exceptions to the contract terms shall submit them to the procurement officer listed above. Requests can be made, but basically the state reserves the right to address non-material requests, etc. So one of the things that's important to note and note when you're working on a contract is that by submitting the RFP, the offer is accepting state terms right away in the beginning. So that was, in general, what we want you to understand about mitigating risk in state contracts. And now we're going to get into the weeds a little bit. When I was trying to find a picture of a weed today, it kind of cracked me up, but I felt like that was the appropriate picture of weeds. We're going to talk about appropriate insurance and bonding requirements, termination language, limitation of liability, and indemnification clauses. I know that's exciting, everybody. Everybody calm down. Okay, so another poll coming up. How much experience do y'all have out there with insurance and what kind of insurances to pick in state contracts? All right, it looks like some, again. And it looks like only 2 people have a ton of experience with insurances. So I hope to lean on those 2 people in a second. Choosing insurances is something that seems a little intimidating. So we're going to go through the general steps here. Okay, insurance and bonding requirements. So types of security, bid security and contracts performance security. Acceptable forms of that are surety bonds, letters of credit, money, cashier's checks. We talked a lot while developing this training, and we don't have a lot of experience with bonds or bonding. So if you have worked on a contract where bonds were involved, we'd love to hear from you in just a minute. An example of when bonding is appropriate is when there is a real risk of theft in banking contracts, or the risk to the state is high if the contractor fails to perform. Have any of my contract officers out there worked with bonds much? You can raise your hand to talk or type it into the chat. All right, Vicki, go. We can't hear you, Vicki. Just have to press unmute.
Sorry
there you are.
that.
Go ahead.
You kind of caught me off guard. I wasn't actually expecting that I was going to be saying anything. But,
I'm sorry. It looked like you raised your hand.
Well, I did, but I thought you were just wanting information as opposed to speaking. But that's okay. The bonds that we have, we use a lot of bonds for our remediation division contracts. And we use any of the acceptable forms that we have. Tracking those bonds becomes just as complicated and sometimes as difficult as it is tracking the insurance documents that we need. Our bonds range from, or our surety ranges from the total value of the contract to whether or to a smaller amount if it isn't needed. But we have had also on occasions the need to invoke those bonds and have them carry on and take care of the final process. The other kind of bonds that we also have that we deal with are same types of situations, but we have a lot of permits in our agency for things like coal or gravel pits or mines that we have that we give a permit to. One of the requirements under that permitting process is to have a financial surety to complete the reclamation process if something goes wrong with the company that's doing the work. And unfortunately, in our current circumstances economically, we've had quite a few bankruptcies where we've had to have the bond kick in to carry on the reclamation process. And sometimes that gets really difficult because you've got not only having to have the surety company release the bond to us so that we can take the money and run. We also have issues where it might be a bankruptcy involved, and then who has claim to that money. So bonding, depending on what you're doing with it, the biggest thing that I would say is make sure that you have your legal involved in that process, because there are a lot of things on the tail end that can come into play. So your bond documents have to be very clear as to who gets the bond if something goes wrong, who's going to be the one that takes the money and finishes the project or whatever it is that you have the bond to cover. So, and one of the other things that I'm saying it here, one of the other things that I've tried to step away from is calling it a bond, because it isn't always a bond. We have had bonds, truly, we have those, and they are the predominant documentation that we get for surety, but we also have letters of credit and we also have cashier's checks. We usually don't get money, and the thing that we've learned on our end too is that we don't take the surety and put it into the treasury if it's like a contract surety. But if it is permit surety, it's a different story, and that does have to go into our into the Treasury and be recorded through Sabres. So that's another thing that I would let anybody know, depending on what kind of surety you're dealing with. Make sure you have your fiscal people involved as well, so that they know what they'd have to do with the cash or the money or whatever it happens to be.
Thank you so much. So that's really interesting. So do you feel like upfront you're able to craft the security in a way that is clear at the end of the contract if something happens, or do sometimes you wish you had gone, you know, hindsight's 2020 basically? But
well, I think for DEQ, hindsight was 2020 years ago when we had some issues. And so we've made sure that our bonding or our surety language in our solicitation is very clear as to what will happen if we have to take the bond and use the bond. We make sure that's very clear, either in the solicitation document we have or the permit that we have when we're doing all of that kind of thing. That's just our business. We make sure that's very clear so they understand, and that's at the upfront level. So in solicitation or a project, it would be at the solicitation level. We lay it all out in the solicitation, exactly what's required, why it's required, and what will happen if we have to take the bond. And so we make sure that that document that we have them sign and fill out is also very clear. So we use your D of A's document because we have a few other really odd kind of things that affect just DEQ and the remedial world. We have added those to our bond document and our surety documents so that they can make sure that they have that language. And the other thing that we have dealt with the companies, the surety providers, whether it be a bank or you know, whatever the institution is that actually issues that form of surety, we work very closely with them. And if they don't use our documents that we put in, because we use bond documents, is what we prefer bonds. So we say in there that we want them to get a performance and a payment bond. But if they can't get that and they're going to go with a letter of credit or something along those lines, we still provide them with that bond document so that they can make sure that whoever issues the letter of credit has the same language in it as is in the bond. And that way we're covered.
that's great.
Whatever they decide to give us.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing, because it really does go back to that general idea of the first slide where, you know, you want to get it in the solicitation and you want to get it right up front. Megan wanted me to mention that you can track bonds in Emacs Total Contract Manager, just so you know.
DEQ's not there yet. I'm pushing.
Carrie, did you have an example? Thank you, Vicki. Carrie, did you have an example? Well, maybe not. That's okay. But that was a great example, Vicki. So I'm going to talk a little bit about insurance. Now we do have a document that I will send out to everybody with best practices for insurance. So you'll be able to take that with you and consider it. Basically, with insurance, there's just a few steps you want to go through. Step one, determine what type of insurance should be required. There are 5 separate types of insurances: general liability, automobile liability, professional liability, workers' compensation, and property insurance. The next step is to evaluate risk and determine limits. In the handout I'm going to give you, there's a table to help you get the level of risk, low, moderate, or high, and some suggested limits for each level. The level of risk may vary within the same contract. Then you need to get your certificates of insurance. Getting certificates and endorsements helps ensure compliance with the hold harmless clause. And policing certificates. Remember, the certificates supplied are not just adequate documentation. A checklist of what a certificate should contain includes limits of liability, a clear description of coverage and the extension endorsements, statement that the policy is force and no material change will take place without prior written notice to the state, and the state is named as an additional insured. I'm going to bring up that document real quick. So just give me a second. So we've put together a tracking and monitoring contract insurance requirements document. It's going to be hard to see this. But I just wanted to give you a sense of what is included in the document. So basically goes through determining what type of insurance should be required, the steps that I talked about. And here's some more in-depth description of the types of insurance and when they should be used that I talked about earlier. And then here is the information about evaluating risk and determining insurance limits. So general liability, auto, professional liability, property replacement, and more information about certificates of insurance and policing certificates. And we have a best practices for requesting insurance, how to track and monitor insurance, and a little chart here of insurance coverage by contract type, which should help you a little bit. And then we have an example of a certificate of liability insurance. So you can see what it looks like and compare that with what you end up using. All right. Yes, I will be sharing all of this after the webinar. Don't you worry at all. Okay, so what we wanted to make time for here was your story. Who has a good insurance story they want to tell? Because we want to hear.
Well, Natalie, since nobody else wants to talk, apparently, I just want to bring up an important point that we didn't have actually included on the slide, which is cybersecurity liability insurance. And I think that's really important to consider on IT contracts, especially, but even in some cases, if it's not IT, but a contractor is going to have access to a system that might have PII or HIPAA protected information in it, that would be something that you would want to consider in those cases in case there is some type of data breach. We'd want to make sure that the states and as well as the citizens' information that's within those systems are protected. So just one I
Could
want.
you remind us what PII is?
Personally identifiable information. But I know there's got to be others out there with insurance stories, but we can move on and come back if anybody thinks.
Yeah, if you think of something, just let us know. So these were the type of, this is John's car right here that I included on the slide. He gave you this picture. This is the different types of insurance that we talked about, and there's the cyber liability right there. So one of the other types of insurance is professional liability. Okay, so always work with your legal counsel. That's our message. But one of those things would be a medical consultant or a accountant. And Lisa wanted me to tell you that Total Contract Manager can help store the insurance documents and provide you reminders to get those. Thank you. All right, and now either John or Megan is going to talk a little bit about termination language.
All right, thanks, Natalie. Termination language, as you can see on our slide here, termination for cause versus convenience. Please keep in mind when you're looking at this, termination for convenience is an option. Termination for cause should always be in your contract. And don't be surprised if you include a termination for convenience that the contractor doesn't come back and ask for the same language for their side. Meaning they can give us written notice that they're going to walk away from the contract via termination for convenience. So if you include that in your contract, just be prepared for a request for that to come back from their side as well. Notice to cure, consider the length of time, and that will depend on the contract. The length to cure issues in a contract will certainly be different for the provision of service pins versus a massive IT project. So be sure to keep that in mind, the complexity of the contract and the project when listing your notice to cure requirements and the timeframes of when cure has to be accomplished. Breach of contract. If you're going to ever consider breach of contract, Natalie hit on this earlier, document, 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 document. A lot of that goes to the contract management. Have regular meetings with the contractor, document the results of those meetings, the discussions, the dates, the times that those were held, what the issues were and that were raised during in the meeting, what the next steps to address those issues are, provide timeframes for when those are supposed to happen, because you're going to need all that information if and when you get to a point where you're going to have a breach of contract or a termination for cause. So always document all of those. But the big thing there is communicate. Your contract manager should be in constant communication with the program and with the contractor, making sure everybody's on the same page. You're meeting timelines, milestones, the work's getting done on time and on budget, and document issues, document conversations. That includes even when they're doing a good job. That's just good contract management. The conversation was held this time, this date, what was said, and where we're going. Contractors have a right to terminate as well. Again, If you include convenience, they'll ask for the same terms. They'll also have the same termination for cause language. So it is important, again, to document all those meetings and to have those meetings. Don't just roll along, let it go, and then come to a point where you're at issues and you've not had any communication or documentation for those. Performance bond, we talked about that just a little bit here a few minutes ago. You can collect on this if there is a performance issue. You can't hold it over their head as a penalty, but it's there as a safeguard. Stop work orders, suspension of work orders, the IT stop work order, and CIO, we have standard language that they maintain the right to issue a stop work order. Again, if you're getting to this point, go back to your documentation. Before you take any steps regarding termination or breach, talk to your legal counsel. And if you have questions, you need assistance, you can always call state procurement at 444-2575. That's for TIA. So let's cover the termination for convenience real quick. When would you invoke a termination for convenience? You might do it if the product or service is no longer needed. On receipt of notice, the contractor should stop work, given the time frame. Typical is 30 days, but again, tailor that to your project in your contract. Keep in mind, the contractor may have to terminate any subcontractors and prepare a contract closeout. Make sure you get all the materials, any state materials, all invoices been paid, so on and so forth. So all that's covered in our contract management class. Keep in mind, the agency may be responsible for the inventory or manufacturing costs, or both up to that point. And again, written notice to the contractor is required and a reasonable time frame must be provided. Termination for convenience is found in statute section, Title 18, Section 4, 224(3) sub D. It states an agency may permit the inclusion in state contracts a clause providing for appropriate remedies relating to termination of contract for the convenience of the state. Again, termination for convenience is an optional clause. Termination for cause is required. Termination for cause is a written notice of failure to comply with contract terms and must be provided to the contractor along with a reasonable allowance to cure the failure. This is allowed for in 18.4 224(3)(c), providing appropriate remedies relating to the termination of the contract for default. One thing to keep in mind here is termination for cause requires due process. And a termination for cause is really a 5-step process. First step is try to resolve the problem by working directly with contractor's on-site supervisor. If performance does not improve, you move on. Contract manager would contact the contractor to resolve the performance issues. And again, if the performance does not improve, a more formal meeting with contract manager, the contractor, and contracting officer should be held. And if the performance does not improve, you can begin initiating action according to contract provisions. If you did it right, you should have those provisions in your contract. If the enforcement has not produced the desired result, you move to contract termination and work with your attorney. And if it's a solicitation that we done the solicitation on your behalf, work with us and our contract officer. We'll work with you to make sure we take the appropriate steps, documentation, so on and so forth. If you terminate for convenience, you cannot take a bond that was required. Keep that in mind. Again, a reminder, 30 days is standard language, but that's just a recommendation. And state agencies can change that depending on the risk of their contract to the state and to the contractor. Again, write everything down. You will need solid evidence to terminate a contract because chances are it's going to a legal proceeding from there. So those legal proceedings are going to rely heavily on your documentation and your communication. And the final step, talk to legal before you do anything with the final step of termination. With that, I think it's up.
We got a few questions. Oh, go ahead, Vicky, if you want to talk. We have a few questions. Peggy, I'll get to yours, but Rick asked, what would you consider the difference between breach of contract and termination for cause?
So we would consider the breach the act or the cause, and the termination for cause is the action resulting from the breach, ending the contract.
Okay, thanks. Vicky?
Sorry, I was muted. I just wanted to bring up, as far as the termination period, the whole process of terminating, just make sure when you first start that one of the questions that you asked is, what have we done to ensure that we have complied with the terms of the contract on our end? Because we've had a few times where they've wanted to terminate an agreement, and part of the issue was that we ourselves were not performing in accordance with the terms and conditions. And you can't terminate when our lack of action or our inability to comply or failure to comply with those terms and conditions caused the problem on their end. And that was a big eye-opener for some of our project managers. So that's a question that I ask a lot of the time. Are we in compliance?
That's a good point. Got to keep your own side of the street clean, right?
Yes.
And then Peggy has a question, I think, about the insurance slide over here. Commercial is when a vendor comes on site for insurance, but what about consultants and or work being done not on site with insurance? Any ideas, John?
Megan and I both think it would be commercial general liability, Natalie.
All right, there you go. Any more questions or comments about insurance or termination language? All right, we're going to roll on. Megan now is going to talk about the fascinating details of limitation of liability.
Well, geez, I hope I can live up to that intro because it is super fascinating. Good morning, everybody. So limitation of liability and indemnification clauses are typically the most negotiated clauses, at least that we see in our office, I would say for the most part, between contractors and the state, because really this comes down to who's assuming the risk with the contract, and that's going to impact potentially the cost of your contract as well, which is kind of why we hone in so much on making sure that you think about and include these clauses in your standard template on the front end of your solicitation so that vendors can see what the terms are and bid accordingly. So if you have, for example, like a performance bond requirement, that is going to be an additional cost to the vendor that typically they would include with their bid. And so, you know, thinking about, is that something that we really need or not, is going to impact your cost. So limitation of liability will potentially do the same. This clause is intended to narrow the scope or limit the amount of damages to be borne by a party in the case of certain transactions or events. Typically in our standard language, you're going to see our limitation of liability is capped at 1 or 2 times the contract cost. There are a couple different options that you can flush out depending on the type of contract you have. So I know our standard language, for example, doesn't necessarily work for a contract that maybe you're buying goods on an as needed basis, or, you're getting services, but, there's maybe a large cost up front, and then, over the life of the contract, the cost goes down. How are you determining the liability and the risk throughout the life of the contract? So those are things that are negotiated pretty frequently to make sure that each party is, bearing an appropriate amount of risk for the contract. This is definitely a clause I would recommend working with your legal or contacting State Procurement Bureau, and we can help you discuss maybe what your options would be and the best course forward. But I just wanted to make sure folks were aware of the purpose of this clause and why it's so important, because, literally one word change in that clause can really have a significant impact. So next slide, I'll just touch on indemnification clauses as well. The indemnification is intended to transfer risk between the contract parties. In most cases, these clauses are used to make sure that a potential loss will be compensated. So your limitation of liability, hold harmless, and indemnification clauses kind of all go hand in hand. Like, worst case scenario, if something horrible were to happen, who's going to be on the hook for it and for how much? So the indemnification clause is a key piece of that as well. I'm notes here. Things that you want to consider with your indemnification clause. Again, we have standard language included in our contracts, which is going to cover the state in most cases, but it is a clause we recommend agencies look at and make sure it's going to meet their needs for each specific contract. So things to consider: does the clause include not only an indemnity, but also hold harmless, which is the release of liability, and duty to defend clause, which in our standard contract templates we do, but just making sure that those both, again, go hand in hand and are in the contract. Is the duty of defend expressly stated? Are the indemnities, legal fees, and costs of defense included within the scope of indemnity? What losses are indemnified, and who is being indemnified? So those are kind of the key points when you're looking and negotiating those clauses of, our standard language, I think, covers, the state, its agents, contractors, etc. So we do cover who is being indemnified, and then what losses. And I know we have negotiated this clause in IT contracts, especially, to kind of add to what losses we think should be covered in the indemnification clause, which may include losses due to, say, a data breach or something like that. So just a couple of points. I know these are very legalese type clauses, and again, we do recommend you work with state procurement or your legal counsel if you're negotiating anything in these clauses outside of our standard language. But I just wanted to make sure folks had an understanding of what they were, what they do, and why they're important in our contracts. So that is my high level overview, and I will pause and see if anyone has any questions.
Any questions on indemnification clauses or limitations, limitation of liability?
Phew, I got off easy.
No kidding. All right. So that's pretty much what we have for y'all. We're open to questions about any aspect of the presentation or anything that you want to talk about. And I'm just going to give a little poll as we make that transition right now, just to see who is paying attention. So who is your most important resource when making these kinds of decisions about a contract? Is it legal counsel? Is it SPB? How about Google? Netflix? Or if you've got another answer, you can put it in the chat. You can always ask Yoda, or maybe, I don't know, baby Yoda. Sarah Snell says, always ask Mike Mannion. I can't believe no one said Google. Maybe you guys are paying attention. You could always ask your magic 8-ball. And I think the only person in America who still has one is apparently John Thomas. He keeps it in a sports car. Anonymous attendee said, thank you, and you're welcome for this. And just know we're here to support you as you're working on this stuff. In terms of resources, I'm going to send out the insurance best practices, the slides, the recording, and then here's our contact information. And you can always reach out to Brett Dahl in risk management. There's his number. You can also find him in Outlook. Any more questions or comments?
Natalie, I just want to say thanks again for everybody joining us today. And we hope that you find these short little topical webinars helpful. That was some feedback we had received from agencies. So any other topics or suggestions you have for just these kind of short little tidbits of information, please send them to Natalie or anybody here in SBB, and we can get working on that and get some information out to you guys as some additional resources. So thank you again, and hope you all enjoy the nice weather and have a happy Mother's Day weekend.